Now, Donald Trump has announced an immediate end to all trade negotiations with
talks with Canada are lagging behind those with
the United States has revealed its biggest trade irritants with
the United States and Mexico formally launched the review process weeks ago. They are already announcing next steps. They have already moved into technical discussions on supply chains, rules of origin, and manufacturing. Meanwhile, Canada is still standing out.
We are having our first formal negotiations with Mexico on the USMCA, and we are doing it just as the president said. We're having talks separately with Canada, but we've moved along with Mexico. Canada is behind on this. With Mexico, we're already at the stage of some formal talks. Let me explain that again in much simpler and clearer terms. Right now, we are sitting down with Mexico for the very first time in a formal way to talk about the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which a lot of people just call the USMCA. And we are doing this exactly the way the president told us we would do it.
We are having our first formal negotiations with Mexico on the USMCA, and we are doing it just as the president said. We're having talks separately with Canada, but we've moved along with Mexico. Canada is behind on this. With Mexico, we're already at the stage of some.
We are not mixing everything together. We are not trying to talk to both Mexico and Canada at the exact same time in the same room. Instead, we are having separate discussions with each country. That means we are talking to Mexico on one track, and we are talking to Canada on a completely different track.
Country is getting hammered with tariffs when our steel sector is exposed, when our auto sector is exposed, when businesses are desperate for certainty ahead of a major CUSMA review. The last thing any serious minister should be saying is that talks have resumed in a sense. What does that even mean? That doesn't make, what do you mean in a sense? Either talks are back on, or they are not back on. We are looking at humiliation on the brink. And the real issue, while Dominic LeBlanc is feeding Canadians vague, mushy, bureaucratic nonsense, well, Mexico, south of the U.S., is already way further down.
But here is the honest truth about where things stand right now. We have made real progress with Mexico. We have moved ahead. We are already at the point where we are having formal talks.
Really disappointing news, especially for the Canadian steel and aluminum industry in particular, who are really counting on some form of short-term relief. I know we were not going to get to a broad-scale deal with the United States that had been signaled quite clearly from the Prime Minister, but certainly a lot of hope and optimism towards a deal, perhaps as you mentioned at the APEC summit in South Korea.
Talks with Mexican officials. That means we are exchanging specific ideas. We are looking at documents. We are talking about real changes and real commitments. Meanwhile, Canada is behind. Canada has not reached that same stage yet. They are not at the point of formal talks in the same way that Mexico is. So when we say we are moving along with Mexico, we mean that the machinery is turning, the conversations are happening, and there is a sense of forward motion. With Canada, that forward motion is just not there yet. And that is a problem because time is not standing still for anyone. When a country is getting hammered with tariffs, when our steel sector is exposed.
It's not a secret what American beefs are with Canada at the moment. And there are things here, you know, if you hold it up against last year's report, for example, that are perennial irritants in this relationship. So, you know, no shock, supply management, milk classes, cheese standards, they're in there. Also, Canada's treatment of American digital giants. Yes, the Digital Services Tax is no more, but there's still the Online Streaming Act, the Online News Act, French language protections, CanCon requirements, the CRTC.
When our auto sector is exposed, when businesses are desperate for certainty ahead of a major CUSMA review, the last thing any serious minister should be saying is that talks have resumed in a sense. What does that even mean? That doesn't make... What do you mean in a sense? Either talks are back on or they are not back on. Let me break this down so that
our relationship relative to the US and Japan or US and South Korea or Europe is that our economies, GP, are very integrated. Our supply chains are very integrated.
Everyone can understand why this is so frustrating. Imagine your house is on fire. Not a small fire, but a big one that is spreading quickly. Now imagine someone tells you that they are going to help you put out the fire, but only in a sense. What does that mean? Either they are helping or they are not. There is no in between. The same thing applies here. Canada is getting hammered by tariffs right now. That is not a future worry. That is not a maybe. That is happening today. Our steel sector is exposed, which means companies that make steel and the workers who depend on those companies for their paychecks are feeling real pain. Our auto sector is exposed, which is a huge deal because the auto industry supports hundreds of thousands of jobs across the country. And on top of all that, businesses are desperate for certainty. They need to know what the rules are going to be. They need to know what to expect, because we are heading into a major review of CUSMA, and that review is going to decide a lot about how trade works between our countries for years to come.
To take them seriously, even if we think they're negotiating in bad faith, because this agreement accounts for 75% of our exports to the world and about 60% of our imports. It is our preponderant trading relationship. And as you know, we're trying to diversify trade, but this is still the most important market for us, and you can't change geography, and whatever happens, it's still going to be a major market for.
So with all of this happening, with tariffs hurting us, with our steel and auto industries hanging in the balance, with companies begging for clarity, the very last thing anyone wants to hear from a serious minister is that talks have resumed in a sense. That kind of language does not help anyone. It does not reassure businesses. It does not calm workers. It just creates more confusion. Because what does, in a sense, actually mean? Does it mean that people are picking up the phone? Does it mean that someone sent an email? Does it mean that there is a meeting scheduled but nobody knows when?
Our auto companies have been eating the impacts of the tariffs, and that's what we're seeing in the latest profit reports. They also say it's only a matter of time until the companies pass those costs off onto the customer. Now, these earnings reports are the first to come out since the tariffs went into effect. Those auto tariffs set at 25% on foreign-made vehicles and 25% on some car parts. GM reporting their billion-dollar profit loss is mostly driven by those tariffs. Stellantis blaming tariffs for part of its $2.7 billion drop during the first half of the year. The president's tariffs are meant to bring supply chains back to the U.S. GM is investing $4 billion into U.S. plants, but those cars won't hit market for another.
You see, the problem is that, in a sense, is a wishy-washy phrase. It is the kind of thing you say when you do not want to commit to anything real. Either talks are back on, which means both sides are sitting down, talking seriously, exchanging proposals, and trying to find solutions. Or talks are not back on, which means nothing is happening. There is no middle ground here. So when someone says talks have resumed in a sense, what they are really telling you is that talks have not fully resumed. And that is not good enough. Not when so much is at stake. Not when workers and businesses are waiting for answers. Not when the clock is ticking toward that big CUSMA review. It is not a secret what American beefs are with Canada at the moment. And there are things here, if you hold it up against last year's report, that are perennial irritants in this relationship. So, no shock, supply management, milk classes, cheese standards, they're in there.
70% of what we sell you is not for final consumption, but it goes into your production supply chain. So, I'll give you an example. We sell about $100 billion of oil at huge price discounts, by the way. $100 billion, which you turn into $350 billion of final sales. So that means that the refinery worker in Baytown, Texas.
I think we're pretty much on schedule in regards to what our interests are and where we want to be at this time. We're not surprised. We're fully aware that they've started discussions with the Mexicans, but a lot of the discussions they're having right now is in regard.
Also, Canada's treatment of American digital giants. Yes, the Digital Services Tax is no more, but there's still the Online Streaming Act, the Online News Act, French language protections, CanCon requirements, the CRTC regulations. Let me spell this out in plain language so there is no confusion. The things that bother the Americans about Canada right now.
Retaliatory measures that Canada has taken in the wake of the trade war. You think of things like the provincial liquor monopolies, their decision to pull U.S. booze off the shelf. This report says that needs to be immediately restored. It also talks about buy Canadian procurement policies, those also causing new friction.
It's going to be give and take on both sides. It's not going to be a one-way street. And so that's the reason why Canada is going to set up the right conditions so then when we are sitting down together and talking to each other, that we'll talk about our issues and we'll talk about American issues.
They are not surprises that came out of nowhere. Everyone knows what these issues are because they have been around for a long time. In fact, if you look at last year's reports and the year before that and the year before that, you will see the same problems coming up again and again. These are what we call perennial irritants. That means they are like a small rock in your shoe that never goes away. No matter how much you shake your shoe, the rock is still there. And these irritants include supply management, which is the system we have in Canada for things like dairy and poultry. The Americans do not like it because they say it limits their access to our market. Then there are milk classes, which is a more technical part of that same system. But basically, it is about how we price different types of milk for different uses.
We live in a very decentralized federation. We are coordinated. But, what they're saying to us is, solve all these problems, give us all the things that we want, and then we'll sit down and talk. This is a negotiation. If we are going to be moving on certain issues, they need to move on other issues. And that's the way the conversation.
I think it stands that this is a devastating blow right now to the Canadian steel and aluminum industry and frankly to the Canadian economy quite broadly, right? I mean, we're seeing really a wave of incoming, like a layoff tsunami in many sectors right now amongst our clients, and any bit of relief would have been certainly much welcome, whether in steel or other sectors as well, such as wood.
Then there are cheese standards, which might sound like a small thing, but for dairy farmers and cheesemakers on both sides of the border, it is actually a big deal. So those three things alone are enough to cause tension. But wait, there is more. The Americans are also unhappy about how Canada treats their big digital companies. Now, yes, the digital services tax is gone. That particular tax that Canada was planning to put on American tech giants is no longer on the table. But that does not mean the problem is solved, because Canada still has the Online Streaming Act, which forces streaming services like Netflix and Spotify to contribute to Canadian content. And Canada still has the Online News Act, which forces big tech platforms to pay Canadian news outlets for their content. And then on top of that, there are French language protections, which are very important to us as a country, but which the Americans see as barriers to their companies. There are CanCon requirements, which are rules that say a certain percentage of what you see on TV or hear on the radio has to be Canadian content. And there are CRTC regulations, which are all the rules that our telecommunications and broadcasting regulator puts in place. So when you add all of this up, it is a long list. And the Americans are looking at that list and saying, we want changes. That is their position. That is what they are bringing to the table. We live in a very decentralized federation. We are coordinated. But what they're saying to us is, solve all these problems, give us all the things that we want, and then we'll sit down and talk. This is a negotiation. If we are going to be moving on certain issues, they need to move on other issues. And that's the way the conversation is going to unfold. Here is something important to understand about how Canada works. We are not a country where one central government in Ottawa makes every single decision all by itself. Instead, we live in a very decentralized federation. That means provinces have a lot of power. Provinces control things like natural resources, healthcare, education, and a lot of the rules around agriculture and trade. So when we talk about supply management, for example, that is not just a federal issue. That involves dairy farmers in Quebec, in Ontario, in British Columbia, and other places. That involves provincial governments that have their own interests and their own voters to answer to. So yes, we are coordinated. The federal government talks to the provinces. We try to speak with one voice. But it is not simple. It is not like flipping a switch. Now, what are the Americans saying to us? They are saying, solve all these problems. Give us everything we want on supply management, on milk classes, on cheese standards, on digital services, on streaming, on news, on French language rules, on CanCon, on CRTC regulations. Give us all of that. And then, after you have done all of that work, after you have moved on all of those issues, then we will sit down and talk. Do you see the problem with that? That is not how a negotiation works. A negotiation is not one side giving everything and the other side giving nothing. A negotiation is supposed to be a two-way street. It is supposed to be give and take. If we are going to move on certain issues that matter to the Americans, then they need to move on certain issues that matter to us. That is the only fair way to do this. We are not going to hand over everything they want and then just hope that they will be nice to us later. That is not how Canada negotiates. So when we finally sit down together, the conversation is going to unfold like this. We will talk about our issues, and we will talk about their issues. We will say, okay, on dairy, maybe we can do something, but in return, we need something on softwood lumber, or on dispute resolution, or on something else that matters to our workers and our businesses. That is what a real negotiation looks like, not one side dictating terms and the other side just accepting them. 70% of what we sell you is not for final consumption, but goes into your production supply chain. We sell about $100 billion of oil, at huge price discounts, by the way, $100 billion, which you turn into $350 billion of final sales. Think about this number for a moment, 70%. That means that out of everything Canada sells to the United States, 7 out of every $10 worth of goods are not things that American families buy and use right away. They are not toys or televisions or sneakers sitting on a store shelf. Instead, they are parts, materials, components, and ingredients that go into American factories and American production lines. They are the steel that becomes a car. They are the aluminum that becomes an airplane part. They are the chemicals that become cleaning products. They are the wood that becomes furniture. So when Canada sells something to the United States, most of the time, it is not the final product. It is the stuff that American companies use to make their own products. That means Canada is deeply integrated into the American economy. We are not just a neighbor that sells you finished goods. We are a partner that helps you build things. Now let us talk about oil, because that is a huge part of this relationship. Every year, Canada sells about $100 billion worth of oil to the United States. But here is the thing that a lot of people do not realize. We sell that oil at huge price discounts. That means American buyers pay less for Canadian oil. $100 billion worth of Canadian oil becomes $350 billion worth of final sales in the United States. That is $250 billion of extra value that American companies and American workers create because they have access to affordable Canadian oil. So when people talk about trade with Canada as if it is only about what Canada gets, they are missing the bigger picture. The United States gets a huge benefit from this relationship too. Canadian oil helps fuel American factories. Canadian parts help build American cars. Canadian materials help make American products. This is not charity. This is mutual benefit. I think we're pretty much on schedule in regards to what our interests are and where we want to be at this time. We're not surprised. We're fully aware that they've started discussions with the Mexicans, but a lot of the discussions they're having right now is in regards to compliance. From where we are sitting, we feel like we are pretty much on schedule. That means we have a plan for what our interests are. We know what we want to achieve. And at this point in time, we are roughly where we expected to be. We are not surprised by anything that is happening. We knew that the Americans would start talking to Mexico first. We knew that they would have separate talks with each country. That was not a shock to us. We have been paying attention. We have been watching. And we are fully aware that a lot of the discussions that the Americans are having with the Mexicans right now are not about big new changes to the agreement. Instead, a lot of those discussions are about compliance. That means they are talking about whether Mexico is actually following the rules that are already in the agreement. Are they enforcing labor laws? Are they meeting environmental standards? Are they doing what they promised to do? That is a different kind of conversation than the one we will have with the Americans. Our situation is different. Our relationship with the United States is different. So we are not worried about the fact that Mexico is having talks right now. We are focused on our own path. We are focused on our own interests. And we are moving forward according to our own schedule, not according to anyone else's. You have to take them seriously, even if we think they're negotiating in bad faith, because this agreement accounts for 75% of our exports to the world and about 60% of our imports. It is our preponderant trading relationship. We're trying to diversify trade, but this is still the most important market for us, and you can't change geography. Whatever happens, it's still going to be a major market for Canada. Here is the reality that we cannot ignore. Sometimes it feels like the Americans are not negotiating in good faith. It feels like they are making demands without being willing to give anything in return. It feels like they are moving the goalposts or changing the rules in the middle of the game. And a lot of people in Canada might feel like we should just walk away or refuse to engage, but we cannot do that. Because this agreement, the USMCA, or CUSMA as we call it, is enormous for Canada. It accounts for 75% of everything we export to the entire world. Think about that. 3 out of every $4 worth of goods that Canada sells anywhere on the planet goes to the United States. And on the other side, about 60% of everything we import into Canada comes from the United States. That makes the United States our preponderant trading relationship. That is a fancy way of saying it is our biggest and most important trading partner by far. Now, yes, we are trying to diversify. We are trying to sell more to Europe. We are trying to sell more to Asia. We are trying to build trade relationships with other countries so that we are not so dependent on any single market. That is a smart, long-term strategy. But you cannot change geography. The United States is right next door. The border is 5,000 miles long. The roads, the railways, the pipelines, the power lines, they are all already built. So no matter what happens, the United States is still going to be a major market for Canada. That is not going to change next year or the year after. So even when we think the Americans are negotiating in bad faith, we have to take them seriously. We have to show up. We have to engage. Because the cost of not doing that is too high for Canadian workers, for Canadian businesses, and for Canadian families. It's going to be give and take on both sides. It's not going to be a one-way street. And that's the reason why Canada is going to set up the right conditions, so that when we are sitting down together and talking to each other, we'll talk about our issues, and we'll talk about American issues. Let me be very clear about how we see this playing out. This negotiation is going to involve give and take on both sides. That means Canada will give some things, and the United States will give some things. It is not going to be a one-way street where only Canada makes concessions and the United States just takes. That is not how a fair agreement works. That is not how a healthy trading relationship works. And that is exactly why Canada is going to set up the right conditions before we sit down for serious talks. We are going to make sure that we are prepared. We are going to make sure that we have talked to the provinces, to the territories, to industry, to labor, to everyone who has a stake in this agreement. We are going to make sure that we know what our priorities are and where we are willing to be flexible. And then, when we are sitting down together with the Americans, we will talk about our issues. We will talk about the things that matter to Canada, like protecting our cultural industries, like ensuring that we have fair dispute resolution mechanisms, like making sure that our workers are not undercut by unfair trade practices. And at the same time, we will talk about American issues. We will listen to what they want on supply management, on digital services, on all of those perennial irritants. And we will try to find a balance. That is what a real negotiation looks like. It is not about winning or losing. It is about finding a deal that works for both sides. This is the economic future of an entire country whose prosperity still depends enormously on access to that American market you are trading with. At the end of the day, this is not just about trade statistics or legal texts or political talking points. This is about the economic future of an entire country. Canada's prosperity still depends enormously on access to the American market. That is just a fact. No matter how much we try to diversify, no matter how many other trade deals we sign, the United States will always be our biggest customer. And that means we have to get this right. We have to negotiate smartly. We have to stand up for our interests. But we also have to be realistic about what is possible. We have to be firm, but we also have to be willing to find common ground. Because at the end of the day, millions of Canadian jobs depend on trade with the United States. Thousands of Canadian businesses depend on that relationship. And the prosperity that Canadian families enjoy, the ability to buy groceries, to pay the mortgage, to send kids to school, A lot of that comes from the work we do and the goods we sell across that border. So when we sit down with the Americans, we are not just negotiating a trade agreement. We are negotiating the future of our country. And that is something we take very seriously. We are having our first formal negotiations with Mexico on the USMCA, and we are doing it just as the president said. We're having talks separately with Canada, but we've moved along with Mexico. Canada is behind on this. With Mexico, we're already at the stage of some formal talk.